recording now. And I'm going to introduce our speaker today. I'm very, very proud that we have been able to get Dr. Harvey J. Kaye to join us. He has just said that he's recently retired. He's a professor emeritus of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. He's the founding director of the university's Center for History and Social Change and an award-winning writer who has authored and edited 18 books, the most recent among them, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, our focus today, Take Hold of Our History, and finally FDR on Democracy from 2020. Kaye also has contributed to a diverse array of publications, produced videos with Jacobin, the Gravel Institute, and appeared on numerous TV, radio, podcasts, and YouTube shows, among many others. I'll just mention, include the Bill Moyers Journal. And I'd like to learn a little bit more about him also appearing with Turner Classic Movies. He received a BA at Rutgers, MA at the University of London, and his PhD at Louisiana State University. His academic career includes study at the National University of Mexico, a visiting fellowship at the University of Birmingham, the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, Inclusion on Nations 2014 Progressive Honor Roll, and selection as an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. And notably, there is a speaker series on the state of democracy that has been named after him at the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. Yes, he lives with his wife Lorna in Green Bay, where they continue to back the only fan-owned NFL team, the Green Bay Packers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker today. Thank you very much, Harvey Kaye. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I got to say, I'm really honored. I really got a kick. I was really thrilled when the invitation came. I should note that one of the reasons I retired is exactly what I'm looking at right now, all of the people with their faces obscured. And the reason I say that is I had never intended to retire, but the idea of sitting in front of a computer to actually lecture or give a talk was with the idea that people would not show me their faces. And I was pretty tough with students if they didn't do what I said, but I can't do that with my peers. So I'm not going to order you all to please reveal yourselves. Maybe some of you are getting ready for bed, given where you are in the world, or have just woken up, given where you are in the world. Something else I was going to say is that I'm behind you in time, Sue, just so I'm okay. But I am north of you in Wisconsin, north of Toronto, just so you know. I always get a kick out of that. And we had snow overnight. And so the snow you have now is probably sent to you by us in Wisconsin. Now, having said that, Wisconsin itself is not the state that I originally came to. I grew up in the New York area, and Wisconsin in 2010 became a state ruled by Walker and the Republicans. And literally the redistricting that took place even now is just determining the composition of the legislature. And it's just incredible to me that I came to the capital P progressive state where Robert La Follette and later Senator Nelson and other folks really did pursue progressive politics. And right now the Democrats are truly in the minority. So for what it's worth, I'll just tell you that I've been mentoring some of the first year assembly people to actually to compose, to write, to author an economic bill of rights for Wisconsin, which was an FDR idea back in 1944 that I'll mention. And I'm hoping that this can be a model for people around the country, because we cannot win if we just try to win elections, for the record, okay? Now, I asked Bruce to there's a quote that I'd like you all to see to begin my talk. Do you have that to put up, or should I, or not?
Just one moment, I'll get to that.
I also have to apologize if I go a bit late. I hope I'll be interesting enough that you won't get upset with me. Okay. So this is a quote that when I was working on the fight for the four freedoms, really just planted itself in my head. And at first I thought, I actually was enthused by it. And I kept thinking how lucky we are. We are lucky people. But the beauty of the quote is that it provides a final section of import. And I'll explain in a moment that it's a rather misleading quote. We are a lucky people. We have had leaders when the national life was at stake. If it had not been for Washington, we might not have become a nation. If it had not been for Lincoln, we might have been split in two. If it had not been for this later Democrat, we might have succumbed to a dictatorship. That's Roosevelt, who he's referring to. For that was the alternative, much in the air when he took charge. It is important that younger Americans who did not know him should understand what he found, what he left, and above all, how he went about his work. His attitudes and the devices he used are the ones called for among us. They will have to be improved and used again. Our troubles are not over. They will never be over. We must hope for other such leaders in other days of crisis. They can learn from studying the Roosevelt technique. That was in a book entitled The Democratic Roosevelt, published in 1957 by Rexford Tugwell. Rexford Tugwell was one of the original Brains Trust members in 1931-32 that literally sort of helped manage the Roosevelt campaign of 32. He later entered the administration as the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture under Henry Wallace. I believe later he served in other roles in the administration. And this was one of two books he offered in reflection of his time and his knowledge with Franklin Roosevelt. Now, I love that quote, and I love using it as a device. And most people who hear it get a kick out of it too. The problem is it's actually rather misleading. Okay. In fact, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, if they're the figures who I believe they were, would probably be the first to insist that actually what saved the nation from destruction in the 1770s, the 1860s, the 1930s, and 40s was not simply that Americans were lucky to have them as leaders, but all the more that they were lucky to be leading through three truly great generations of Americans. Three generations determined to secure, sustain, and advance America's original revolutionary promise of freedom, equality, and democracy. Now, admittedly, and let's not take anything away from Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, they rallied and inspired. There's no question about that. But they would never have become the three greatest leaders in American history had it not been for the fact that they were pushed further than they might otherwise have gone. And I'll even say radically further. I tend to use, I'm going to move my chair, but I tend to use two terms interchangeably, not only with respect to the Progressive Caucus, but with respect to the American story, progressive and radical. And I admit they are somewhat different, but I tend to use them interchangeably. Well, anyhow, the tragedy is today that after 45 years of class and culture war campaigns by corporate bosses, Republican conservatives, and Democratic neoliberals, Joe Biden, the Democratic Party leadership, and we, the people, ignore or fail to appreciate how we have historically prevailed over our enemies, both foreign and domestic, and transcended the crisis we've confronted, not by trying to recover the soul of America and restoring the status quo ante, but by remembering who we are and by acting to make America radically freer, more equal, and more democratic than ever before. And that's what we need to do today. And to refer to the Build Back Better stuff, we have wasted a whole year. And we can talk about that later if you wish. The Biden administration has wasted a whole year, but we have failed in many ways to do what we should have been doing. And I just want to mention two things. The first is that the remarks I'm going to offer you today are a somewhat scaled down version of a keynote speech I gave at the unveiling or the opening, of the first public event after the initial opening of the Four Freedoms Park in New York City, the FDR Four Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island in the East River. And it was on the occasion of the 69th anniversary of FDR's passing, which I'll make use of as a device in here. And the second thing I should warn you about, if you haven't already picked it up, is that I wrote The Fight for the Four Freedoms, not simply as an historian, but as an advocate, a historical and a political advocate. Now, there are those, and especially on the left, I would say, who think that we make much too much of FDR and the greatest generation. I definitely think we make too little of them, and I hope to explain that, if not fully in the talk, afterward in my remarks. I think we are failing to remember what made FDR and the greatest generation truly great. And I want to say that they are, to my mind, the most progressive generation in American history from the 1930s through the 1960s. Now, my generation of the 60s likes to think that we made the 60s, but in fact, the greatest legacies of the 60s, not perhaps of a cultural sort, but of a political and legislative sort, were actually made by a generation that was formed in the 30s and fought World War II and came to literally lead the country in the 60s and to pass, I'll repeat this later, Medicare, Medicaid, immigration reform, civil rights and voting rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyhow, my argument in the book, if any of you have had a chance to read it, right from the beginning, is that we need to remember. And I think historical memory is fundamental to progressive action. So I'll now commence the official talk. And when I began work on the fight for the four freedoms, I had the good fortune of coming onto the writings of Max Lerner, a Depression era and wartime set of essays and books just really, really excited me as a progressive columnist and editor, who later in life, I think it would have been in the 70s, became rather conservative. But the point is, from the 30s and into the 40s, actually called himself a Marxist Democrat with a capital M and a capital D, and later remained very much a progressive, again, until the sort of late 60s, post-60s period, which was not unusual. And it's the case that what really excited me about Lerner's is the vision or the understanding he had of American history. And I will also tell you that I think it was a vision that he shared with FDR. Now, in a book published on the very eve of World War II, a book he brilliantly titled, "It is Later Than You Think." I would have titled a recent book of mine with this title, but I didn't want to plagiarize. "It is later than you think, the need for a militant democracy." And this is the line that really struck me. The basic story in the American past, the only story ultimately worth the telling, is the story of the struggle between the creative and the frustrating elements in the democratic adventure. And I used to put that proposition on all my syllabi, all my course syllabi. And I'm convinced that if FDR had happened to read those words, that he too would have relished them, for he continually advanced that very kind of story of America in all of his greatest speeches. Now, Lerner, as I've said, stood to the left of Roosevelt, but in critical ways, he stood firmly with the president through the 30s and into the 40s. When I thought about what I would say on the then 69th anniversary of Roosevelt's passing, I could not help but recall the column that Lerner published on the first anniversary of FDR's death in 46. It was a piece titled, "FDR, the People Remember." I'm going to quote at some length here. "A few days ago," Lerner wrote, "when it had become clear that the whole nation would observe the first anniversary of FDR's death, the New York Daily News, the then very conservative New York Daily News, published a griping editorial. Why, it asked, should Americans be observing both Roosevelt's birthday and his death day? Even for Washington and Lincoln, one observance was enough. Why does this fellow rate two?" And the answer, Lerner said, is that people remember in their own way. And recalling how Roosevelt had rallied Americans to fight first the Great Depression and then European fascism and Japanese imperialism, he spoke of how they might well be remembering their late president. Now, there's another quote he said that he wrote. "They remember the collapse of an economy in 1929, the pathetic inaction of the men who boasted themselves the leaders of America. They remember the Hoovervilles, the bread lines, the farmers' riots, the bonus march, and the Battle of Anacostia Flats, the blank and fearful despair of the world's greatest nation. They remember the crippled man to whom they turned for leadership. They remember his words, 'The only thing we have to fear is fear itself,' and the succession of crisis measures that came with the staccato authority of communiques from a battlefield. They remember the hope that began surging back into their hearts, that America might have found its greatness again." Lerner then spoke in equally moving terms of how Americans were probably recalling Franklin Roosevelt's wartime leadership. And I've really compacted these remarks. "They remember the looming shadow of fascist power, the man who recognized the enemy for what it was and sought against heartbreaking odds to educate a whole people out of their isolationist dream of peace and security to the awareness of danger. They remember the news of Pearl Harbor. They remember the day when Hitler's Continental Wall was breached and we knew victory would be ours. And they remember the spring day when the news came that their president would no longer be with them to lead their victories and shoulder part of their burdens. Now, I've cited then, and I'm citing it now, Lerner's column, not to validate our own many and diverse efforts at remembering both Roosevelt's birth on January 30, 1882, and his passing on April 12, 1945, but rather to call our attention to the question it essentially poses to us who were not there in the 30s and 40s, to us who neither elected FDR nor served as soil soldiers in the CCC, construction workers in the WPA, GIs in the military, Rosie the Riveters in a war plant, or volunteers with the Red Cross or the USO. To us who have only heard the stories, read the books, and seen the movies. The question is, how and what do we remember of FDR? And for that matter, how and what do we remember of the men and women whom we've come to call the greatest generation, the men and women who made FDR not only their greatest leader, but one of the three greatest presidents in American history? Those of us who live in the long, long shadow of that president, that generation, and all that they accomplished, how and what do we remember? As a critical question, as the late political scientist Wilson Carey McWilliams observed in 1984, when Reagan was running for re-election, a people's memory sets the measure of its political freedom. Now, clearly, we do not fail to remember. Okay, we've built two magnificent FDR memorials, one in DC and one in New York, where I originally spoke at the FDR for Freedom's Park. We've also built a great monument on the National Mall to those who fought World War II. And, you know, we've read the books, we've seen the movies, we've attended the events. And yet for all of that, we're failing to remember the most significant thing, arguably the most democratic and inspiring thing, the very thing that we now most need to remember. And let me make it clear, we don't forget by accident. Conservatives have done everything in their power, with all the more authority given their control of so much of American political culture these past 45 years. They've done everything in their power to make us forget. That's first. But the other thing is that liberals from the beginning failed to remember what really transpired in the 30s and into the war years. And they were willing to celebrate FDR without recognizing, to use a term we're not necessarily commonly using these days, there was this dialectical relationship between a president and a people, probably the most small d democratic relationship of any generation and its leader. Now, when all that president and that generation fought for is under siege, and we too find ourselves confronting forces, corporate and quasi-fascist forces that threaten the nation and all that it stands for, we are failing to remember what made FDR and that generation truly great. Yeah, we remember that they rescued the United States from depression, that they defended it against fascism in the Second World War. And we even remember that they, after the war, turned us into probably the strongest and most prosperous country on earth and in human history. However, at the cost of their memory and legacy and our own prospects and possibilities, we fail to remember that they did all of that against fierce anti-democratic opposition at home. And despite their own terrible faults and failings, I mean, I celebrate them, but let's face it, there were plenty of anti-Semites and racists galore, okay? Despite all of that, they made America freer, more equal, and more democratic than ever before in the process of doing all that they did. Indeed, we are forgetting what they themselves came to see. Indeed, what Americans before them in the 1770s and the 1860s had come to see. My original talk, I repeated this sentence 3 times. I'm gonna do it only once right now, okay? That the only way to truly defend, secure, and sustain American democratic life is to progressively, indeed radically, enhance it. Franklin Roosevelt, who knew American history, who believed in America's purpose and promise, and who had extraordinary confidence in his fellow citizens. And I want to make it clear, the greatest fault of the Democrats today is they have no confidence in their fellow citizens. And I mean that. And I'm willing to argue with people about that, okay? He knew this even before he was elected president, and he firmly believed that his fellow Americans did too. He had learned about it from his reading of US history, but also, not only that, he had also, with Eleanor's assistant, learned it from working people, rural and urban, both immigrant and native born. It was that knowledge, that belief, and that confidence which gave him the strength and the courage to state in 1930, in the midst of the worst economic and social catastrophe in American history, that, quote, "There is no question in my mind that it is time for the country to become fairly radical for a generation." He said that, nobody remembers it, okay? He wrote it to a friend. Admittedly, he didn't do it in a public address, but it was there in writing and was readily available if people wanted to hear it. To call in the 1932 presidential campaign for not only a new deal of pro-working people policies and programs, but also a new, and this is something people do forget, which was in a major speech, he called in 32 for a new economic declaration of rights to guarantee life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the Declaration promised. And to declare in 1935 that democracy is not a static thing, it is an everlasting march. And he was right. His fellow Americans did recognize it too, and they responded to his words and initiatives with energy, enthusiasm, and determination. FDR once said to a very important journalist of the day, you know, I've got a lot of progressive ideas, I'm paraphrasing, but I never want to be too far out in front of my fellow citizens. And what he discovered is that they sometimes were out in front of him and literally pushing and pulling him to act in a way that he had the spirit to act, but not necessarily the immediate capacity to act. Now, together, president and people severely tested each other. They made terrible mistakes and regrettable compromises. They suffered tragic defeats and disappointments, and they left much to be done. However, now you're progressive Democrats, so you probably know much of what I'm about to tell you. However, challenging each other to live up to their finest ideals and aspirations, president and people advanced them further than either had expected or even imagined possible when they started out on that adventure. They not only rejected authoritarianism, and let me make it clear, leading figures in the United States, magazines such as Vanity Fair, the president of the American Political Science Association, made it clear that they would have welcomed, or at least it might well be possible, that a Mussolini might become president at the next election. And at least that way, maybe to paraphrase things, the trains might run on time, okay? Well, anyhow, that president, that generation redeemed the nation's historic promise by initiating revolutionary changes in American government and public life and dramatically extending freedom, equality, and democracy. Through a host of alphabet soup agencies and popular associations, from the SEC, the CCC, the WPA, the REA, and the TVA, to the CIO, the AYC, and the NAACP, if anyone wants to know what they mean, ask me afterward, they subjected big business to public account and regulation. They empowered government to address the needs of working people, and they established a social security system. They organized labor unions, consumer campaigns, and civil rights groups, and they broadened and leveled the we and we the people. They built schools, hospitals, post offices, and parks. They expanded the public infrastructure with new roads, bridges, and dams. They planted billions of trees, fought soil erosion, and improved the American landscape and environment. And they cultivated the arts and refashioned popular culture. Just think swing music. Doing so, they also imbued themselves with fresh democratic convictions, hopes, and aspirations, all of which propelled FDR to not only profess, in the midst of all this, I do not look upon these United States as a finished product. We are still in the making. He was a nation builder. To not only declare that, I love this quote, he did this at a military a memorial. A true patriotism urges us to build an even more substantial America, where the good things of life may be shared by more of us, where the social injustices will not be encouraged to flourish. And to not only famously proclaim that this generation has a rendezvous with destiny, but to articulate America's grandest strivings, past and present, in a vision of 4 fundamental freedoms. After rallying Americans to turn the United States into the arsenal of democracy in order to sustain Britain against the Blitzkrieg, the president made it very clear in his January 41 State of the Union message that the defense of the nation called not for giving up or suspending what they had struggled so hard to achieve in the New Deal, but for strengthening, in his words, democratic life in America by building upon those achievements. And then, in the spirit of the Declaration, the preamble to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and the Gettysburg Address, he said, in the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. The third is freedom from want. The fourth is freedom from fear. The vision was international, but Roosevelt rooted it firmly in American experience and aspiration. Americans did not fail him or themselves. In the name of those freedoms, 16 million Americans, 350,000 of them women, put on uniforms and pursued a global struggle. At the same time, Americans back home would not only pray for their safe return, but also go all out to provide the arms and material required for victory and to protect and improve what they were defending. Once again, they tested each other, they made terrible mistakes, sad compromises, and suffered serious defeats and disappointments. Yes, I can hear it in people's minds every time I talk in those terms. Racism sorely marked the war effort, a racism that in the form of anti-Semitism denied America's historic role as an asylum for mankind, a racism that produced a Jim Crow segregated military, a racism that interned Japanese Americans. Nevertheless, believing in the nation's promise and refusing to be defined by that racism, Americans of every creed and color served historically in every phase of the war effort. American Jews made up only 3% of the population. 550,000 joined up, ending up 4% of Americans in uniform. Latino and Native Americans were also overrepresented, with 450,000 and 44,500 serving respectively. And though limited by an official quota, 1 million African Americans served. Even 22,500 Japanese Americans served, despite the fact that many of their own families were interned in camps. Every line I'm saying has any number of tangents. I am resisting the tangents, okay? Forgive me for maybe going on longer than you wanted me to. In all their diversity, Americans not only prevailed over their enemies, they once again compelled each other to progressively enhance American democratic life. Now, congressional conservatives and reactionaries did their damnedest to deny the promise of the 4 freedoms. When I say reactionaries, I mean Southern Democrats, even to the point of trying to deny overseas GIs the right to vote. They did everything they could to block it. Why? Republicans rightly feared the GIs would vote for FDR. And the Dixie Democrats rightly feared that Black soldiers would get to vote and like it. But despite the opposition, President and people expanded the labor, consumer, and civil rights movements, subjected industry and the marketplace all the more to public control, further reduced inequality and poverty, and further transformed the meaning of we and we the people. Moreover, polling in 1943 showed, listen carefully to these numbers, that the vast majority of Americans look forward to pursuing new liberal and social democratic initiatives at war's end. 83% wanted to expand Social Security to include national health care. 83%. That included 75% of Republicans and 95% Democrats. 90% favored joint planning by government, business, and labor to do away with unemployment. 73% supported not only launching New Deal style public works projects to provide jobs after the war, they also supported a policy in which the federal government would actually guarantee a job to those who needed it. Guarantee a job. Now, those numbers, which FDR knew very well, they were reported to him, led him in remember, this is the president who in 32 had called for an economic declaration of rights. In 41, for the 4 freedoms. Now in 44, he proposed, I know you guys know this, but let's say it, that the nation enact an economic bill of rights to make the promise of the four freedoms all the more real for all Americans. As he presented it, the second Bill of Rights would include the right to a job with a living wage. He always yearned to sign into law a living wage. The right of every family to a decent home, the right to health care, the right to security in old age, and the right to a good education. But as much as an overwhelming majority wanted all of that and proceeded to elect FDR to an utterly unprecedented fourth term, which will never happen again, I hope, meaning no one should ever get that, it was not to happen. A right-wing congressional coalition of Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats effectively opposed it. Now, there's an irony at this moment. Very few people realize this. FDR called for a GI Bill of Rights, and Congress was not keen on doing it. And he wanted the GI Bill of Rights to include all the workers who had been moved from the Midwest and elsewhere out to California for shipbuilding, or to the East and the Gulf Coast for shipbuilding. Well, anyhow, he proposed this, and the arch conservative American Legion picked up the idea and pushed it. And what really made it happen was the combination of this utterly progressive president backed by this utterly conservative veterans organization, the American Legion. In fact, it was even bigger than FDR had originally asked for. And it's the largest social democratic program imaginable up to that point in American history, which enabled 12 million veterans, 1 in every 10 or 11 Americans, to progressively transform themselves and their country for the better. Now, I know I'm going on too long here, so I'm gonna try to compact this. Okay. The point is that it didn't end. This generation, okay, this generation was basically 15 years old in 1935. They didn't even become 45 until 1965. And if you look at the arc of that generation, which we could call the age of Roosevelt, even though he passed away in 1945, this generation really did continue to transform America, not only in the way that Tom Brokaw talked about, prosperity and security and all of that. They literally pursued the progressive agenda that had been impressed upon them and that they had yearned to pursue during the 30s and the 1940s. Okay, so we know that during the 50s, they built new communities, churches, schools, unions, civic associations. They launched the construction of the interstate highway. They secured ever higher living standards for themselves and their families, and poverty, though it persisted, was being reduced. And in the 60s, they recommitted the nation, even if they didn't always use the term, to the four freedoms. Those who were to march for civil rights, campaign to end poverty, organize public employee unions, push to enact Medicare and Medicaid, demand equal rights for women, reform the nation's immigration law, expand public education and the arts, and press for regulating business and industry to protect the environment, workers, and consumers, not to mention protest the war in Vietnam, did not always recite the four freedoms. But there were quite a few who did. And I can tell you, if you get that far in my book, that what is amazing, it really changed my sense of history, is the degree to which the 60s were made by that generation, not by those of us who were in our teenage years in the 60s. We played a role in pushing, but it is the case that all of these changes were led by veterans, civilian and military veterans of that generation. Think about this. Presidents Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, labor leaders such as A. Philip Randolph, Walter Reuther, Jerry Werf, and Cesar Chavez. These are just the high points. Civil rights activists like Ella Baker and James Farmer, feminists such as Betty Friedan, environmentalists like Rachel Carson and Barry Commoner, in and out of the Roosevelt administration, out organizing labor unions in the 30s and 40s. These are the folks who advanced the progressive agenda in the 60s. Now, undeniably, after more than 4 decades of all the class war and culture war campaigns we've endured that have subordinated the public good to corporate priorities and private greed, that have subjected us, that we've allowed ourselves to be subjected to, widening inequality, intensifying insecurities, we've even denied who we are. We've denied the democratic impulses and yearnings we've had. Now, when our democratic rights are under siege, the age of Roosevelt and the greatest generation can seem a very long time ago. And I can't believe I turned 72 this year, for what it's worth. But ask yourselves, do we not embrace the promise of the four freedoms? Do we not feel the democratic impulse that our parents and grandparents passed on to us, imbued in us? Do we not yearn to make America, excuse this line, this is a quote from Max Lerner and Roosevelt, to find its true greatness again? Of course we do. And yet we seem to have forgotten how to do it. We need to remember who we are. We are the children and grandchildren. It's not like these are ancient ancestors of the men and women who, inspired and encouraged by FDR, not only rescued the US from destruction in the Depression, defended it against fascism, and turned it into the nation it became during the 50s and 60s. They did all of that by harnessing the powers of democratic government and making America progressively freer, more equal, and more democratic than ever before. I'm going to close up by saying that Max Lerner wrote in 1948, as the Cold War was really starting to grip the American public imagination. He wrote a column that he titled "The Waste of History." With the memory of the previous 15 years still powerfully fresh in his mind, but now worried about not just the right-wing political reaction we would call McCarthyism, but also the failure of liberals to deal effectively with it, Lerner said, the creative capacity itself seems to have gone out of American political life. The tragedy, he observed, lies in the waste of our experience, in the waiting while all the old blunders are committed over again. I just can't emphasize enough, we have really got to start to remember why it, and by the way, I write because I know Americans do feel this kind of anxiety and they yearn to make history progressively. And the problem is that the Democratic Party is led by those who do not trust their fellow citizens. And the left itself has turned its back on the experiences of the greatest generation of Roosevelt, in particular with the greatest generation, because the Republicans have done such a magnificent job of laying claim to a generation that they have no right to lay claim to. I'm going to cut myself off there. Okay, I'll stop.
Dr. Kaye, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your holidays to come to us at a time when many of us are feeling frustrated and questioning where we go from here as we end 21 and enter 2022. And I want to compliment you because I have the sense that you had the impression that you don't do that sort of thing so well, talking to people online in this format, and I think you did it extremely well. And evidence of that also is people are writing in the chat box. And,
I didn't see.
I think that we're going to now transition to a question and answer period. We're going to use the tried and true Democrats Abroad method, where we enter in the chat box that * hand up so that we can create a queue. And I'm taking the initiative privilege as the chair to get get things rolling here with a first question. In preparation for this, I know that Dr. Kaye is also, you could hear it, thinking about the present and also where we are going to go from here. And I also have the urge to ask him, as I'm sure we're going to focus quite a bit on where we are right now and where we're going. But if you would also like to comment a little bit on what you think, what you've studied, what happened to us in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s to change the narrative and change our trajectory so much.
Yeah, well, for a start, I mean, I've written about this particular period, the 70s, more than I ever wanted to. It turned out, I remember my editor in this book, he said, I wanted to finish the book basically in the 60s. And he said, no, you got to add on. I'm sorry to put it this way, cover your ears. What the fuck happened? That's what he said to me. Okay. And he wanted a title. He fooled me into believing we might title the last chapter that, which we didn't do. Okay. But the thing is that in the course of the 60s, it was, I mean, obviously dramatic transformations occurred, clearly. And what was happening at the same time, and this is what people forget, it wasn't only a cultural development that led to what happened in the 70s. It's that American industry was so dominant in the post-war decades of the 50s and the 60s that they literally had become fat on success and literally ignoring the revival or the competition that might come from Japanese and German industries. And it was called in economic circles, there had been the best way to put it, that there was a profit squeeze, that American capital was suffering a profit squeeze. But management itself really did not, they were starting to run out of ways to innovate. And the question was, how could capital regain its position in the marketplace? Plus, think about all the things that took place in the 60s that challenged the authority of management and capital. Okay, the drug companies were revealed, the thalidomide case. Ralph Nader revealed the automobile industries. Okay, the environmental movement revealed the degree to which we had really pursued environmental degradation. The number of workers killed in the workplace during the years in the war of Vietnam were higher than the number of soldiers killed in Southeast Asia at the same time. I mean, all of this had gotten to the point where the unions were challenging, the consumer movement was challenging. I mean, consumers were outraged at the kinds of things they were experiencing. So there were interviews done by Leonard Silka, the New York Times, and others that showed that leading corporate figures, when they would meet, were willing to actually tell Leonard Silka, who was the New York Times columnist, that capitalism and democracy might not be able to coexist, that capital might have to assert itself over democracy. And in 1970-71, David Rockefeller actually gave a speech to fellow bankers and said, basically, we are under siege. And then Lewis Powell, who was the prominent lawyer, and 2 weeks after what I'll refer to, would be named to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. He issued a memorandum it's called the Powell Memorandum. It's online, you can look it up. Issued a memorandum to the Chamber of Commerce that the Chamber of Commerce literally had to wage, in quote, my words, class war to regain its stature in American life. And then to add, it wasn't just the Republicans. David Rockefeller was the man who underwrote the creation, and this is not a conspiracy theory. He underwrote the creation of the Trilateral Commission. Okay, just look it up. And the Trilateral Commission included not only prominent corporate leaders, but prominent political leaders who were at that time out of office. That included both George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter. And the report that they issued, I keep it nearby. This is NYU Press. They issued this report, The Crisis of Democracy. Maybe some of you know it. It was authored by three figures, trilateral men, Europe, Western Europe, the United States, and Japan. The prominent figure in it is Samuel P. Huntington, now the late Harvard professor. In this, they called for how they put it, basically they said, we have an excess of democracy. We have to temper democracy. And they named the targets: public employee unions, poor people, women, students. They went right down the list of all those folks who might represent a broad coalition, if they ever came together, of progressive politics. So what we saw in the 70s, as I can remember this, as it sounded like a joke at the time, the fastest growing law firms were union busting law firms. And that's what the 70s were all about: break the backs of labor. You had the organization, the Business Roundtable, a whole series of organizations where the CEOs and COOs said that they were not only going to underwrite lobbying, if called upon, they would fly in their jets to DC to lobby against progressive legislation. And in 1978, they literally devastated consumer rights bill, new environmental action bills, and an effort to reform labor law so that no longer would the Taft-Hartley Act be able to block unionization in the South and in right-to-work states. And I'll be honest with you, I don't mean to upset you, but one of the worst presidents of the 20th century was Jimmy Carter. He turned his back on labor, the environmental movement, and the consumer movement, put all of his political capital into returning the canal to Panama, which in itself was a great idea, okay? But he literally turned his back. And the head of the UAW, Doug Frazier, issued a public letter saying that he was quitting the Dunlop Commission on Management Labor Relations, and these are his words, because basically class war had been declared on labor. And then, of course, what did Jimmy Carter do? He deregulated finance. He deregulated the airlines industry. He brought on Volcker as the, what do they call it, the chair of the Fed, and opened the door, all but welcomed Ronald Reagan to the presidency. That's what happened in the 1970s. And as a consequence, okay, in 1980, Reagan won because 10 million working people did not want to vote for Carter. That's what happened. Sorry, did I answer the question?
That's great. Bruce, we have a number of folks who have put their hands up.
All right, before getting to them, I just want to say this has been primarily a book club. Now it is called Mondays for Your Progressive Minds. But hearing that response made me think of Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, too. And some of the points that Dr. Kaye made are elaborated in a very compelling way in that book. And for those of us who haven't checked that out yet, I recommend it very highly. And now let's go on to see.
There's one thing I must add to that, because people will always say to me, well, why did working people turn their backs on the Democrats? Why did they do that? Why did they vote against their own class interests? And this is the punchline, okay? The punchline is this. It was an age of stagflation, okay? Stagnant economy and high inflation. Working people were desperate to protect what little they had in their wallets or their bank accounts. If you can't vote for your wages, you will vote to lower your taxes. And that's what the Republicans promised to do. And by the way, one of the most stupid lines ever issued by a Democratic president in a debate was Mondale saying, "We'll raise your taxes." I mean, talk about being out of touch with the American people. By the way, I am a dues-paying member of the Democratic Party, just for the record.
Oh, we're so grateful to have you in the party, Dr. Kaye. It's just really important to have your voice and other voices like yours here. And we actually have 3 folks who have already put their hands up to ask a question. So okay. I'm going to ask Daniel Stein to unmute and share your thoughts, Daniel. And then after that, we'll hear from Bruce Miller and Katie Solon.
Thank you. First off, thank you very much, Dr. Kaye. I think everything you said so far has been very enlightening. I also am a teacher and understand the desire not to be speaking to people on a Zoom blacked out for the rest of your career. So I understand, I respect that. The question I had was, I guess, two questions. One, the reference you make to how the greatest generation sort of helped found the progresses of the 60s. Is that translatable to how maybe the populist generation founded the reforms or the progresses of the progressive era? And if so, how? And 2, can you speak a little bit, if you know much about the, I'm going to just call it the plot to assassinate FDR during the 30s, which, as I've read in a book called Devil Dog, about the plot to assassinate him, mostly led by or partly funded by the DuPonts. I'm not sure.
Okay, let me let me answer your first one, which I feel more comfortable answering in some ways than the second, but I'm going to put a twist on the second one. First of all, it's a really interesting thing that the populist generation, the capital P populist generation of politicians, were absolutely essential in influencing what transpired in the 30s. And the reason I say that is that first thing to remember is the populists themselves, in many ways, come out of the Republican Party. Okay, so think of the 2 most significant populists, capital P populists. I'm thinking progressives. My mind went immediately to the progressives. Yeah, the populists and the progressives, who, by the way, at the grassroots level, were not necessarily as different. One was more rural and one more urban. But indeed, yes, the populists decidedly shaped these kinds of things because FDR was very much aware of populist politics. Okay. And the thing that most people don't realize is the degree to which the populists of the 1890s also contributed to the making of the Socialist Party. Okay, not necessarily in the cities, but in the South Central part of the United States. It's a really good book by Tim Green, or I'm forgetting, or James Green, I believe it is, who was out of University of Massachusetts, Boston. It was called like Socialism in the Southwest, something like that. So yeah, there's no doubt. And in many ways, what you get is the building as a consequence of labor unions and a socialist politics, which was a social democratic politics. Debs pushes it more in a kind of sort of nationalization model, but it's really a social democratic politics, which, by the way, the progressives who did come out of the Republican Party, and there I'm thinking of, I'm not a big fan of Teddy Roosevelt, but Teddy Roosevelt and then also Robert La Follette Sr. of Wisconsin, who broke with the Republicans because it was such a corrupt party. So if you think about it in those terms, and you think FDR is first running for political office around 1912. And by the way, there's a speech, if I can just, not to sell books, but this book that I brought out, FDR on Democracy, I have in there speeches that haven't been in print in decades. And there was a speech he gave in 1912, and you can see FDR trying to position himself politically. Everyone says, you know, he wasn't an intellectual, whatever, but it's his first speech in 1912 that really shows the degree to which he's trying to come to grips with populism, socialism, and progressivism. And he actually says, well, if I use the word this, they'll call me a socialist. If I say that, they'll think I'm just trying to sustain individualism. And he's really looking for a way through. And this is on his mind for the next 20 years, to the point where he runs for president. And his presidency is a dramatic transformation in the meaning of the word liberal. He takes progressivism, doesn't use it as much, and which he could well have done, and he turns liberalism into progressivism and populism at the same time, which we make the mistake of writing off as mere liberalism, but it actually was the making of American social democracy. It doesn't exactly answer your question, but let me get to the second thing. I'm not a specialist on the plot to assassinate FDR. And though it would not surprise me if the DuPonts had played a role in it. The richest people in America, and the DuPonts and their buddies, they supported Roosevelt in 1932. They weren't crazy about the things he wanted to do, but they feared the possibility, in light of the Depression, that taxes would go up on the rich. And they figured if they could get FDR elected, he was going to bring an end to prohibition. And thus, on every beer that a working man drank, they would pay a tax, and therefore you wouldn't need to tax the rich. And when it turned out that he would not only sign the end of prohibition, but also regularly call for taxing the rich, FDR did not hesitate to use the term, and those words are right there in the speeches, redistribute the wealth. He was ready to do it. It wasn't just the likes of, every man a king, Huey Long, who was ready to do that. It was FDR who talks about redistributing wealth. And the DuPonts were horrified, and they launched the American Liberty League. And they and other rich people spent millions promoting film strips. I don't know if you all know what film strips were. Film strips, radio programs, all these sort of public relations efforts to bring down the Roosevelt administration. They realized they were utterly failing to have any kind of grassroots support, no grassroots support whatsoever. They were failing. So what did they do? A few of them may well have underwritten that assassination attempt. What they also did is they were eager to find somebody like maybe Huey Long, maybe somebody who was a follower of Father Coughlin, maybe a follower of Francis Townsend. They wanted someone who could appeal to working people who could literally create a third party and steal the votes from FDR to enable the Republican to win in 1936. They utterly failed, and FDR won in 36 in an unprecedented electoral victory. So what they've learned, I don't know if the conservatives today learned their lesson, but you can bet the Tea Party as it emerged had a hell of a lot of money thrown into its coffers by the very wealthy. Okay. Maybe they knew how the rich had failed in 35 and 36 to undo Roosevelt.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaye. I'm going to just go straight to Bruce Miller, who's we affectionately call our voting rights Bruce, because we have Bruce Miller and a Bruce Murray working on our activities here in DA, Progressive Caucus. So we can't say Bruce M, and they both happen to live in Austria. So we can't say Bruce in Austria either.
I did notice that. There was I saw that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it sometimes gets shortened to VR, which in this case is voting rights, not virtual reality, although there's an element of that today as well. So Bruce Miller.
So, well, thanks for coming, Dr. Kaye. I really appreciated your talk, and I enjoyed reading the book here.
Well,
my question relates to what you mentioned, that the conservatives, the Republicans, are just better than the Democrats are usually in evoking the past. And I guess it's a little bit inevitable to the extent conservatism is based on, looking back to some idealized past. But I just wanted to ask if you have any pointers on how the Democrats can do better in countering that approach by the Republicans. I just mentioned two examples that are pet peeves. One of the ones is the one that you talked about in the book and called the most radical speech ever given by an American president, Roosevelt's acceptance speech in 1936 at the Democratic Convention, where he talked about the economic royalists, painted this historical picture that was, it was accurate, but it was also an advocacy piece. And I heard that. I'm only a few years younger than you are, and I heard that speech in my 20s. And when I first heard it, I thought, it blew me away. I thought, oh my God, this is great stuff. And yet Ronald Reagan in 1980 in his acceptance speech used the phrase rendezvous with destiny. And it always amazed me that his tongue didn't burst into flames when he did. But, it didn't seem like the Democrats had any effective counter to that. The other example I would use is one not so familiar. It was that Donald Trump trying to make Andrew Jackson one of his symbols. Now, I'm sure that Trump didn't know and doesn't care anything about what Andrew Jackson actually did or who he was. But, among other things, in the nullification controversy, he wound up facing off with his arch enemy, John Calhoun, who in my reading of history is like the evil spirit of American history. And I don't think there's ever been a more Calhounian president than Donald Trump. But yet, everybody just kind of shrugged it off, and there was hardly even any commentary to challenge how goofy that comparison was for Trump to try to identify with the image of Andrew Jackson, who was one of the founders of the Democratic Party. So how would you advise the Democrats to maybe try to change their perspective on this a little bit?
Well, I can't help but tell you that just so you know, I've written many books before this, but my claim to fame in American history is actually this book.
Yeah.
And that book was partly inspired by the speech you referred to of Ronald Reagan.
Oh.
That so pissed me off, that speech, when I was, 1980, I think I was born, I was 30 years old, right?
Yeah.
And it pissed me off, by the way, that speech, and George Will, the conservative columnist.
Oh.
He was outraged because in that speech, Reagan quoted three figures from American history. Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was literally, his memory had been suppressed, or tried to, the Republicans and conservatives had done everything in their power to try to suppress Paine's memory. The first president after Jefferson to use Paine's name in public was Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, so he quoted Thomas Paine, he then quoted Abraham Lincoln, and he then quoted FDR. He quoted three of the greatest progressives in American history. And Will said, what the hell is this? He's supposed to be quoting Burke, not Thomas Paine, right? Or Coolidge, not FDR, that kind of thing. So anyhow, though Coolidge didn't have that much to say. Anyhow, so here's the thing. That sent me off on a literally, I mean, if a 40-year career of trying to reclaim the American past. That is what happened. I trained, by the way, in Latin American studies. My BA, MA, and PhD were all in IR and Latin American studies. But I was so outraged by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan's efforts to rewrite the story of Britain and the United States. That's what they did, and it was phenomenal. And then to try to have education reflect their politics. Actually, sorry, another one of my books is, it's so good that people can see what I'm doing.
Yeah.
This was
Powers of the Past. Yeah.
And that's, of course, Thatcher and Reagan. Okay. So that's first. Then there was the other reference you made to, now I'm going to show you just how ecumenical I can be on this. So look, I've admired Bernie Sanders since the 1980s. And I used to think to myself, geez, wouldn't it be great if someday I could vote for somebody like him or even him for president of the United States? So in 2016, I got to vote for Bernie and he won the primary here in Wisconsin. In 2020, I did so again. But I am outraged by Bernie on one thing. So in 2015, Bernie gave a speech at Georgetown University. He was going to explain democratic socialism, since everyone was saying, what the hell is that? And in that speech, which, by the way, he should have given at the University of Maryland or the University of Virginia, not at one of the most expensive universities in the United States, if you're going to talk about democratic socialism. So he gives a speech and he literally lays hold of the memory of FDR. He talks about FDR, Lyndon Johnson, and Martin Luther King. I thought, this is great. Now get out on the campaign trail, go onto the debate stage, remind Americans that even if you're not a member of the party, you are the hero and champion of the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt. And he dropped it. And he went back, and with all due deference to those of you living overseas, you will never win a presidential campaign election if you run on what they do in Germany and Scandinavia. Okay. And Hillary nailed him in one of the debates. We're not Denmark. Well, of course we're not Denmark, but Bernie just never mentioned FDR. So then 2019, I should say, in the autumn, he went this time to George Washington University across town, another utterly expensive university, to once again explain democratic socialism. And once again, he talks about FDR. And he even talks about the Economic Bill of Rights. I thought, thank God, finally, right? Goes back out on the campaign trail and does the same thing. Now, go to the debates. There he is in the debates, the original debates with Buttigieg and all the rest. And as soon as he brought up Medicare for all, they all pounced on him and said, you're going to bankrupt the nation. And that was his moment to call FDR into the room and say, you call yourselves Democrats?
Yeah.
And then go with that. That last debate with Biden, he could have literally grabbed hold of FDR. By the way, just for the record, I did a Hear the Burn podcast with Brianna Joy Gray, Bernie's press secretary. And it was the weekend of that debate after he had, I don't know if they just lost that debate. It was obvious. She called me and said, we got to put our heads together. We got to figure out how to sell social democracy. But it was too late. It was too late. Bernie failed. He failed. And by the way, even if he didn't win, he needed to get the FDR social democratic idea back in the American public discourse. He needed to create the narrative that would have allowed younger Democrats to not have to be pioneers, but literally picking up the mantle, you might say.
Picking
Okay.
up tradition, yeah.
Yeah.
We're now
Oh, boy.
moving into the present and maybe headed toward the future. But before we talk more about that, I'd like to say we also have our former chair of the Global Democrats Abroad, who is perhaps in Germany, perhaps in Arizona right now with her mother. And she would like to ask the next question. Katie Solon.
Thanks, Bruce, and thank you so much, Dr. Kaye. But before I can ask my question, I am going to defer to my 94-year-old mom, who maybe you've seen nodding throughout your entire presentation. Joe?
As long as she wasn't sleeping, she can do anything she wants.
I am going to be 95 on the first day of March, and hopefully I will have read almost at least 3 or 4 of your books by
Oh,
then.
thank you. Thank you.
Send me the list.
Thank you.
Validated my FDR liberalism. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be going on Pal's bookstore as soon as this call is over.
That's great.
My question, unfortunately, building on the answer you just gave, is why can't we be more like Germany? I heard a wonderful interview on NPR a couple days ago with some German economists and historians talking about the stakeholder capitalism in Germany and comparing it to the
Absolutely.
shareholder capitalism in the United States. And it was a discussion about the strength of the unions and the fact that in Germany, they're not radical and asking for crazy stuff, but they are respected and they're part of every conversation. So the question is, what can we do to revitalize unions? How can we help? What should the US be doing? And before I let you answer, I'm going to add, 2 really quick personal comments.
I got to remember the question. Don't confuse me now.
I'll come
Go
back
ahead.
to the question, stakeholder, shareholder. But in 1980, I worked for the Machinists Union and for Ted Kennedy on his national field staff. We pulled those votes off of Carter. We gave the United States Reagan. I'm sorry about that to this day. Carter was not the best president, but Reagan was worse. And I'm sorry for my little part in that. And then the other thing, I went
Oh, no,
to
don't have. Kennedy should have been the candidate. I leave it at that.
Okay.
I have
Okay.
to apologize, but I
We're-
never voted for Carter. I refused to vote in 76. I was in Louisiana and it was all said. They didn't need my vote. And in 80, I voted for Barry Commoner. I'll never do that again.
Okay. And did you know Dorothy Brown? I went to Georgetown when it was 1/10 the cost that it is today, a small Jesuit university. And since you've carried me back to my 1970s history classrooms, I hope you knew her. Did you?
I know the name, but I got to put it on some work.
This was her field, and she was the head of the history department at Georgetown. For
Okay.
a very long
For the
time.
record, my sister went to Georgetown as an undergraduate. Okay. I was waiting listed at Georgetown, so I don't like them at all.
Well, you Saxon. Now my question, stakeholder versus shareholder.
Okay. Well, first of all, as you probably all know, German labor unions have representation on boards of directors. Okay. But here's the thing. Do you all know Michael Moore's film, Where to Invade Next? Get a chance, watch it. Everyone missed the point of that movie. Everyone said, oh, look at all these great things they're doing in Europe. That wasn't his intention. His intention was all of these European countries are pursuing initiatives that originated as ideas in the United States. So for example, as we, in the late 30s, as we entered World War II, Walter Reuther called for co-participation in the war effort, that the unions should be directly involved at the corporate board level, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, and FDR created war production boards and others in which labor unions were directly involved. So there's lots of those things, but seriously speaking, I kid you not, I don't throw the term class war around lightly. In 1946, the United States experienced a series of general strikes, all that pent up demand and ambition and aspiration. And the Democrats did not, well, Truman, by the way, is not as bad as he's often portrayed, but he just did not know how to handle those kinds of struggles. So labor unions did not even want the deals that they won in 1950 for healthcare and other benefits. They didn't want private benefits. They wanted public healthcare. They wanted all of those things to be at the literally publicly enacted. But capital mobilized far more effectively. And the Democrats just were split between the Wallaceites and the Truman folks, and the opportunity was lost. But the point was that I don't dislike Germany and Scandinavia. I mean, I lived in England and I enjoyed the benefits of national health care. And for what it's worth, she's now a US citizen, but I've been married to a woman I met in Britain. We've been married 49 years now. And, you know, believe me, I cannot believe we don't have national health care, that we don't have reasonable gun control laws, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason we don't is that the Republicans have literally mastered the narrative, the American story, and they have learned very effectively, probably from the slaveholders in the South back in the antebellum years and others after that in the Gilded Age years, when we're in the second Gilded Age. They've learned how to divide working people among themselves. So here in Wisconsin, when Walker sought to literally disfranchise public employees of our collective bargaining rights and succeeded, and by the way, Wisconsin was the first state to grant public employees collective bargaining rights. What he did is he cultivated this argument that public employees were spoiled, that look at their benefits. Okay, look at the salaries, right? And it worked. Now, we occupied the state capitol for weeks on end, but they won. We had a recall and they won. I mean, but I will also tell you, and this is another reason that I resent the party I belong to. Obama ran saying that he would put on his marching shoes if workers were out on strike. When we occupied the state capitol, 100,000, and we did it peacefully. It's the people's house in Wisconsin. Okay, the fact is that Obama never came to Wisconsin, never sent his labor secretary, never sent Michelle. He literally turned his back on Wisconsin.
All right. That takes us front and center to Wisconsin. We have time for two more questions. One's going to come from the west of you in Minnesota. The other one is going to come from the east around Toronto. And we have Ted France, who's a native of Minnesota. I don't know this for a fact, but I always think of him as being maybe someone who grew up near the Iron Range, where there used to be a century ago also socialist leaders. Yep. And we have about 5 minutes to take care of each of the two questions. I ask you all both to keep that in mind. Ted?
Okay, I'm just going to say that I did live in Minnesota for 1 year before I came to Wisconsin. And even now, I can't believe that it's Minnesota that has been more progressive than Wisconsin.
Thank you. I do want to kind of keep it short and simple. Duluth, I'm from Duluth.
I love Duluth.
Just for the right, well, to tell you the truth, I love it in Duluth too. Anyway, so I guess to get down to the basics of it is you spoke of how the Republicans were able to take control of the narrative regarding economic distribution by winning the argument that if they're not going to raise your wages, then we need to lower your taxes. And the thing that really it applies to the past as much to the present. I think one of the reasons why the social market, which is what it is called, and it has 4 different forms in Europe, in the Scandinavian and French and German and Mediterranean varieties. But it seems to have the broad scale, widespread establishment of collective bargaining in, I think it's 80% in Austria have collective bargaining rights. And that to me is the great train that the American progressive movement missed. Because
I want to stop there and change that a little bit more into a question and
yeah,
ask.
I'm gonna get to it. I'm gonna get to it, Bruce.
Right.
The great train that the progressives missed, but it was occasioned by in Europe, it was occasioned by the catastrophe of World War II, where capital was finally brought to the bargaining table. Can that happen? How can we proceed in America to get to that bargaining table without undergoing cataclysmic civil or world war?
Okay, so as you probably know, the labor movement has been under siege, was directly under siege in the 70s. And what was once 1 in every 3 American workers was in a union is now at best 1 of every 10 workers, okay? Public employees are probably more effectively organized in most states than private employees. Okay, I will tell you right now, I'm going to give you a direction. Do you all know who Sarah Nelson is? Sarah Nelson is the president of the Airline Flight Attendants Union. She is I call a young woman. She is the middle-aged woman, actually, young woman who brought an end to the Trump government closure, okay, by threatening a general strike of the airlines industries. She has not gone away, okay? I make it very clear, she and I are very good friends, okay? And I can tell you that I'm doing everything in my power to enable her to possibly launch a campaign to become the next president of the AFL-CIO. We must change the direction of the labor movement. Okay, I don't want to go into the details of what I'm doing, but just believe me, I'm doing whatever I can and talking to fellow labor unionists around the country. That is the way. We have come so close twice to doing what needed doing. And I say that, number one, under Carter, well, 3 times. Under Carter, he turned his back. Then it was under Obama. They utterly failed to push the Employee Free Choice Act when they had 60 votes in the Senate. And now, where it would be all but impossible, but nevertheless, something worth fighting for, the PRO Act, which would once again guarantee rights of collective bargaining and defang the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 that the Republicans imposed on the labor movement. So look, I mean, we're in terrible straits right now in this country, but I do think there are possibilities for action, maybe action that would at least enable us to not lose the House, maybe to actually make a difference. Look, Biden has failed us because he didn't know his history. A year ago, after he won the presidency, John Meacham, Ron Klain put together a group of historians for Biden to talk to, just as the same figures did so for Obama. They always have them talk to the wrong historians. Forget, I don't care what you want to tell me, forget Doris Kearns Goodwin, Michael Beschloss, say presidential historians to a historian and they laugh, okay? They are not critical historians. What Biden needed to hear was not go big. Any idiot could have told him to go big. What he needed to hear is trust your fellow citizens, encourage them to mobilize, make sure they are pushing you, not sitting home hoping, not looking for the soul of America, but looking for the story of America. Okay, I hope that gets it.
I'm going to jump in with my question because it's about action. So I'm really, action by citizens. So I'm really glad that your last response went sort of in that direction, Harvey, Dr. Kaye. And first I want to say, I think you're really good at leading a class on Zoom. And if you're ever looking for a place to teach, I think we could find you a recurring gig with the Progressive Caucus and Democrats Abroad, which, by the way, Bernie won our primary in 2016 with 70% of the vote, which may come as no surprise. And again in 2020, he won, but combined with Liz Warren had about 70%.
Look, the darkest thing I could say to you is, if things go the wrong way, I may be joining all of you. Right.
So you started, I think, early in your talk today, or maybe even in your prefacetory remarks. I'm going to make up a word here. You said that perhaps I'm not sure if you meant citizens, ordinary folks, hadn't done what we could have done in 2021
yes,
or
I
should
meant
have done in
exactly.
2021 to get I think you were thinking of Build Back Better, but maybe also voting rights legislation, some other things. So
Right.
I guess I'd ask you to sort of say a little bit more about that. And if you could help us to sort of focus our, like we're about action, we want to take action. It's good to have conversations and be informed and understand history, but we do want to focus on actions. We have some issues that we're tracking that we want to work on. But I think rather than tell you what those are, I'd be interested in where you would feel we as ordinary citizens without huge amounts of influence of the big actors, that we're kind of, what trains should we be on, what trains should we jump on and be participating in that are going to have the biggest impact in 2021.
Yeah, well, I mean,
so it's a two-part question.
Yeah, okay, well, clearly voting rights has got to be first and foremost, must be. I can't imagine. It's hard to believe the Democrats could have blown this past year as badly as they have. Okay. I mean, in fact, I actually think the first thing that Biden should have pursued was a Voting Rights Act. Okay. You have to guarantee that whatever you do will not be turned around next time around. And voting rights was essential. And the second thing, arguably, if they could have, but I fully admit that Manchin and Sinema, I did not expect them to be as, I don't use this word lightly, as evil as they are. Okay. I did not expect it. But then Biden, what he should have done is what FDR did in 1938 when he wanted to purge the Democratic Party of reactionaries. He went down to the heart of the belly of the beast. He went to Georgia and gave a speech in 1938 in which he said, if you believe in this feudal system in the South, you believe in fascism. Well, before he would have had to use that kind of language, Biden with Bernie, with AOC, you name whoever you want on the team, should have gone to West Virginia. And by the way, told Biden, you're welcome, not Biden, told Manchin, you are welcome to attend, but I will tell you now that I'm going to talk about the imperative of no senator ever blocking voting rights, the PRO Act, and especially for the needs of West Virginia, the Build Back Better. Now, admittedly, he didn't do that. But then, you know what? I think there should have been a coalition. I think the Progressive Caucus inside the Democratic Party is a joke, okay? They are, I mean, one of them is a congressman from here in Wisconsin. They're a joke. Why? Because they do not see themselves going out and mobilizing Americans to do what needs to be done, right? I mean, their votes were going to count. They didn't have to worry about getting reelected. They needed to go out and mobilize people. That's what the Democrats don't seem to grasp. Push organization and mobilization. And look, Bernie can only do so much, right? He was not only chairing the budget committee, he was sometimes going out and trying to get this stuff going. Where are the other Democrats? You know, what is it going to take? I mean, you know, seriously speaking, that line by Lerner, we're wasting history. Sorry, maybe I'm not getting it to answer you what you're looking for. I will tell you, my feeling is that the PRO Act and the Voting Rights Act should have been passed. Why? For a start, because if you want to win, you've got to give people an investment in winning. You don't want audiences to vote. You want people to turn out. Labor unions are the canvassers. Literally the canvassers. Who do you think goes door to door? Okay, not ardent Democrats, ardent Democratic unionists.
Right.
I mean, seriously, when people tell me, and a lot of people tell me this, that they think the Democrats want to lose, I tell them that that's idiocy, but I fear it may be true.
Well, here we are after 90 minutes, and I've been looking in the chat box, and I think many of us are fired up and ready to go into 2022. We have some great opportunities coming up to learn more and take action. And Sue is going to give us announcements for 3 or 4 events coming up in January that I think will demonstrate that much of what Dr. Kaye is saying is high on our agenda.
Am I allowed to stick around?
Yes, we'd love to have you stick around.
Yes, please.
Please do. Please do. Yeah, so I'll just quickly go through the events we have planned. And Bruce, I'd love you to say a little bit about the issues that we're tracking in our Facebook page after that. So on January 8th, we have our monthly meeting, which we call Progress for Progressives. And we're going to be holding that January 8th, and you can sign up on our events page. And that's where we invite all members of the Progressive Caucus to come and hear from our leaders on different issues about what's going on, and we'll share some actions people can take. And voting rights will be on the list. It'll be something that you can take action on. And on January 16th, where the Progressive Caucus is strongly supporting the Reparations Task Force, which is having an event on that day. So that's January 16th. On January 22nd, we're bringing back our Biden-Harris Progress Report series. And this is number 8 in the series, and we'll be calling it Unfinished Business, because there definitely is some unfinished business for this administration and the people power that we want to get in behind them. And then on January 31st, we have our next event in this series, the Monthly Mondays for Your Progressive Minds. And we'll be having a student loan justice event. There'll be resources provided in advance to ground our discussion. And likely that will include a new documentary that's out. So stay tuned for that, although we're pleased to see that the federal student loan payment pause has been extended till May 31st. So at least there's a bit more time for them. And I will also share in terms of January that we'll all need to make our #1 New Year's resolution, which is pretty popular in Democrats abroad, to register to vote. Even if you get your ballot automatically from your state, your vote isn't federally protected in the same way unless you go through your federal registration paperwork that DA promotes through its votefromabroad.org website, where you can, I'm sure everyone here has used it before, you can do your registration online. I'll drop a link to our events page into the chat. Some of those events are listed, others you'll have to go back later in the month to see a link to the event. That's it for announcements, Bruce.
Democrats Abroad, Dr. Kaye describes itself as first and foremost get out the vote organization. And we in the Progressive Caucus believes that in order to do that, we have to mobilize voters by encouraging them to fight with us so that we have something to vote for. And we
Oh, is Bruce frozen or is it me? It sounds like did we lose
He
Bruce? Oh,
froze.
okay, I think Bruce, okay, well, I know that, I think I know what Bruce was gonna say. I think he was gonna talk about our efforts to raise awareness of primary races that we believe will be pivotal in the next, in the coming election year. So we're starting with a focus on Texas, which has a March 1st primary date, and we've got a couple of primary races that we've identified where we feel it's either a wide open field because there's a Democrat who's retiring, or it's a brand new district where anybody can win, and it will be a close race between the Democrats and Republicans. And so we want to ensure that the party's best foot is put forward, shall we say, for hopefully being aligned with the values of the people. We can't take sides in the Progressive Caucus within a primary, but we can raise awareness of primaries as they're happening, and we hope to get the message out to folks in those districts that have exciting primaries taking shape. So I think we're just about done, and I'd love for anyone to stick around for informal chat if we would like to do that. And any closing words from you, Dr. Kaye?
I just want you to know that I belong to DSA, I'm active with Progressive Democrats of America. If there's a progressive effort, I support it, period. I didn't realize you were not allowed to take sides in the primaries. That's interesting. I'll also tell you that if later in this next year, or sometime in this next year, you want me to talk about Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, what made them great, I'm happy to come back and do that. I wish I had the energy to write the book that I want to write on that. So failing that, I'm happy to talk about it.
Oh, thank you very much. Don't be surprised if we take you up on that very generous.
And
very
thank you. I
generous
really
offer.
enjoyed this very much.
Oh, wonderful.
Have a
Thank
happy
you,
New
every-
Year, all of you.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.